Owen Jones.
Well, thanks, John. And in fact, I speak to you live anyway. I want to talk myself about pride. I want to say, firstly, I'm proud to be on the same platform as Nancy, a formidable campaigner for working people. You're going to be a fantastic MP with the best traditions of our movement, and by God, we need people like you in Parliament and at people in this room I've known for years, and they're people who dedicated their whole lives in the fight for socialism, for working people and the Labour movement. And again, I'm honoured and humbled to be with them tonight. And John, I'm particularly proud to be on the same platform as you, because you embarrass me so I can embarrass you. That's how it works. You're one of the most principled and dedicated representatives of working people that this country has ever had. You're a big which has thrown everything at you, which stopped the democratic right of people in the Labour movement to be able to support the policies you were advocating. And above all else, you've always put the movement in front of yourself, often in a frustrating way, it has to be said. He, in a sense, he lacked, if you like, the sense of wanting to be personally ambitious. He wanted to always put the movement in front of him. Now, I want to carry on talking about hope, because I think that has to be our theme, not to be despondent, not to be fearful, but to be optimistic and full of hope. And we've got to make this point about this party. It was founded not to be a party, it was founded to be a movement. And it was founded on the basis that the people at the top, the wealthy, they had their own parties. They had the Conservatives and the Liberals, which did a pretty damn good job of representing their interests. And the point was that working people needed to have an organised political voice. And this is the argument we should be making to the leadership, to make the case, proudly, loudly, unapologetically, that we are bankrolled by millions of working people, whether they be shop workers, whether they be factory workers, call centre workers, nurses, lollipop ladies, people who sweep the streets, the pillars of this society. We are bankrolled by the backbone of this country. And instead, if anyone should be on the defensive, any party should be scrutinised. It should be a Conservative party bankrolled by hedge fund managers, bankers, legal loan government of the rich, by the rich, for the rich. And they accuse us of class war. And when you stand up for the bottom 70%, they call you a class warrior. You stand up for the top 1%, and they call you a moderate. But these people, they're class warriors. And what they're doing is waging that against communities across the country. And as Nancy says, we should be passionately talking about strengthening that link. The whole point is to use it, to get working people selected who can be champions, fighters for working people in Parliament, who understand the issues that affect people on a daily basis that our political and media establishment ignore, often completely intentionally. And we're talking about why it's so important to do that. We're now 5 years into a crisis where working people, unemployed people, disabled people are being forced to pay for a crisis they had absolutely nothing to do with whatsoever. And let's talk about the consequences. Let's talk about those consequences. The longest fall in living standards since Queen Victoria sat on the throne of this country, where the next generation will be poorer than the last for the first time since Berlin fell to the Allies in 1945, where the average working person is £1,500 a year worse off than the Clegg Cameron Lovin in the Rose Garden of number 10, where families have to choose between heating their homes and feeding their children. But of course there are booming industries, there are booming people, like legal loan sharks, for example. Wonga celebrated a 36% increase in their profits. There are rich pickings indeed for the vultures in Cameron's Britain. A million families now dependent on legal loan sharks to pay their rent, their mortgage, to feed their kids, to give them clothes, to pay off other forms of debt. And another booming industry, food banks. 500,000 people now dependent on food banks. This is the 7th richest country on the face of the earth. And apparently we can no longer afford to feed our poorest people. What an absolute scandal of austerity Britain. And friends, we carry on, we go on all night. We can talk about the army of zero-hour contract workers, to return to the Victorian era, where the doco would march to the yard in the morning, stick their hands up and hope for the best, hope they'd get some work. That is now the fate facing young people, particularly, and others right across this country. And then we have the degrading treatment, the humiliating treatment of disabled people at the hands of the national scandal that is at us. Stripped of their support, driven into misery and anguish. Again, all too often ignored by the media and the political establishment. We have at the moment over 5 million people stuck on housing lists, social housing lists, because of the successive government's failure to build social housing. This is the reality of austerity Britain, which this government of millionaires has of course imposed on so many people, on so many communities. Now it's interesting, because when we talk about making the wealthy with their booming bank accounts paying a bit more tax, we're often accused of the politics of envy. But it's the politics of envy this government has promoted more than any other. And they actually attempt to make the poor envy each other. They say to you, if you're a low-paid worker, your benefits, your in-work benefits, your tax credits slashed by this government, your wages slashed by your boss. And they want you not to resent them, but the unemployed scrounger down the road. In the private sector, where pensions have been decimated, call centre workers, supermarket workers, pensions taken away. They don't want you to be angry at your boss. They want you to be angry at the nurse next door whose pension is still intact. And where has this politics of divide and rule ended up at? This is where it's ended. It's ended with public money spent on vans sent to proud mixed communities, spray painted with a sort of slogan shameless politics of divide and rule. That to say to people that we've mugged you, so we should be mugging your less deserving neighbour as well. Shameless on the part of a government which wants to redirect anger away from anyone but those who plunge this country into this mess. And that's why we've got to go on the offensive, and this is why I'm optimistic. Take the bedroom tax. One of the most unjust and cruel policies inflicted on people in this country by a government in generations. A policy which forced people with no money at all to cough up what they didn't have. A policy of collective punishment by a government for the failure of successive politicians to solve the housing crisis in this country. Thousands driven to the point now, of course, of eviction. I mean, a mountain to climb. People said the social security so-called debate is too poison. You can't win people over. It can't be done. But because of the dedicated campaigning of people across this country who gave a platform to those otherwise airbrushed out of existence, public opinion has dramatically shifted against it. 6 out of 10 Britons now demand, according to the polls, the repeal of this policy. And we brought so much pressure to bear as a movement that the Labour leadership has now come out and said they will abolish it. But friends, that is a victory for our campaigning from below. That is the lesson that we don't know how much the housing crisis costs in terms of sleepless nights, communities turned against each other, kids in overcrowded homes with nowhere to study. But we know how much it costs the taxpayer. It costs £24 billion in housing benefit, lining the pockets of private landlords charging extortionate rents. So let's demand this. It's not a radical policy. Even that well-known lefty Boris Johnson has backed this policy. To let councils build housing, creating jobs, stimulating the economy. Crisis. Now again, in years to come, they will look back at the day when people could go off to work, slog their guts out, work all hours, and still come home with a pay packet that didn't allow them to make ends meet. A quarter of women now unable to make ends meet with the wage that they get. So we must demand, again, no ifs and no buts, a living wage, no more subsidising bosses. We've got 6.5 million people looking for full-time work that just isn't there. So we've got to demand an industrial strategy by this government, create hundreds of thousands of renewable energy jobs, taking on the environmental and the jobs crisis as well. Let's talk about the banks. We bailed them out, but we nationalised the debts and privatised the profits. So we must demand, we the people, demand a public investment bank accountable to us, which will help rebuild our shattered economy. Let's talk about tax justice. Now all of us have to pay our taxes. We don't have an army of smug lawyers and accountants who get seconded to the Treasury, help write tax laws, and then go off to tell us how to avoid the laws they themselves have written. £25 billion lost because Amazon, Google, Sir Philip Green and the rest, they've said we do not have to pay our taxes. So we must demand, no ifs and no buts, change the law. So whoever you are, you will pay your taxes, every single penny. No-brainer. We spend 4 times more subsidising this privatised, fragmented joke of a railway system. So we demand, and again, it doesn't cost anything. We demand, instead of, again, with record levels of prices, pricing out millions of people, so we can subsidise the profits of the rail barons, we demand as each franchise comes to expire, bring each back to public ownership, with passengers represented on boards for a people's railway that all of us can actually be proud of. Friends, I don't think these are wacky ideas, to be perfectly honest. And if you look, and you go out and talk to people, as so many of you do, these are mainstream common sense ideas. So it is up to us to put pressure on the Labour leadership, to keep on pushing, like we won over the bedroom tax, to win all these others. And I want to end by saying this. All the gains we have, all the rights, they weren't given to us by the goodwill and generosity of those above. They were won through the struggle and sacrifice of those below. It was our mothers and fathers, our grandmothers and grandfathers and our ancestors before them who built this country, who built the welfare state, who built the NHS, who won workers' rights. We stand on the shoulders of giants, and we owe it to them. We owe it to them after they struggled and fought at such cost to themselves, often ignored and airbrushed out of existence, persecuted in their day, ridiculed, reviled and imprisoned. We owe it to them, with all they struggled for, to fight to make sure nothing that they fought for is stripped away from us. That is our responsibility and our duty. And I believe this passionately, as a movement, as a Labour Party and wider Labour movement, working as a coalition. If we stand together, we fight together, we will win this battle together.